Oh, moment. These wireless things never work, do they? First of all, thank you very much indeed for inviting me here. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here. I'd just like to briefly start by explaining who the GSMA is, because many of you may not know. We're the Global Mobile Trade Association that represents more than 740 mobile operators on the planet in more than 218 countries and territories, which is technically more than the United Nations. And if you're trying to get consensus amongst mobile operators, it's about as easy as it is at the United Nations. It's very important that you realize that we are completely operator-led. We have a board of 26 members. They're all operators. We have 13 operator CEOs. We have a smattering of CTOs, CXOs, etc. So we represent the people that buy technology and deploy it, not necessarily those that actually develop the technology in the first place. So we're not a technology lobbying body per se. Now, I've been asked in 20 minutes, and Nacho insists that I only have 20 minutes, to give you an overview of the current mobile situation, to look at some key trends, to present some ideas on business models, and indeed to present one or two GSMA initiatives. So if I start rattling very fast, please forgive me, but 20 minutes is a very short time to cover all that. This first slide is very busy, but it's got a couple of very simple messages. The first thing I want you to note is that there are 3.5 billion mobile phone users currently on the planet. Now, we're going to use a lot of billions in the talks we have over the next couple of days, so it's important to put that in perspective. There are, I think, approximately 2 billion TV sets on the planet, something like that. Maybe just a little bit over 1 billion fixed lines, a little bit over 1 billion PCs, and there are less than 500 million, in fact, less than 400 million broadband lines, but there are 3.5 billion mobile users. The other important thing about this slide is that by 2012, there will be something like 5.7, nearly 6 billion mobile phone users. Of that, we are entirely confident. So not only has mobile already reached approximately half of the population of this planet, and very few technologies do that, it will actually continue to do that. If you look at the slide, what I've tried to show here is the regional breakdown, and to show you the winners and losers, but only in relative terms, because all of the numbers are going up, in terms of which region will have the lion's share. Now, one point I'd like to make here, which is often forgotten, is that despite all of the attention on new technology, future technology, there's a lot of growth still even in 2G. As it stands right now, in China, we have more than 10 million net new ads on GSM a month. In India, it's more than 9 million. That's together 19 million new customers per month, and that trend is still increasing. I was talking to the head of Ericsson Radio a short while ago, and he told me they'll ship more GSM equipment in this year than they have ever done before. So there is still an awful lot of growth in 2G, in 3G, and of course, in that which will come after. Now, this slide may look a little bit biased, and my apologies if it looks like an advert for GSM technology. It's not meant to. It's simply trying to point out that this is a question of scale. You're probably not aware of this, but the GSM family of technologies represents nearly 90% global market share. And the reason that's important is because of the graphic on the right-hand side, which shows you the price decline, the average sales price in the handsets, and of course of the silicon that powers those handsets. It's effectively an inverse hockey stick. It's very important. Very few technologies will ever reach that. One of the reasons we have reached that is because we use only open standards, and I'm sure that some of the speakers will be coming back to that topic a little bit later on today. And we have competition in chipsets, devices, infrastructure, service provision. A lot of competition has driven this price down to the levels that we're currently seeing. I don't know if you know this, but you can get a fully featured GSM handset for less than $25. I thought I'd focus on some of the regional differences. I represent a global trade association, but we're based in London. It's pretty easy to be Eurocentric. It's pretty easy to be complacent and even arrogant. Actually, there are a lot of leaders outside the developed economies, and they're leading in different ways. If you look at, for example, China and India, we have very profitable companies who have $8 ARPUs per month. A lot of Europeans would struggle to be profitable at that kind of level, but we have people in China, in India, in the Philippines, like Smart as well, with EBITDA margins of something like 60% plus. So that's quite interesting, to say the least. And it takes a new way of looking at things to do that. In terms of outsourcing, we have people like Bharti in India. We used to have Sunil Mittal on our board. He would have outsourced himself if it was possible. They've outsourced everything else. Again, they're leading the world in that respect. I'm going to talk a little bit about mobile finance later on. And if you look at the leaders in that field, if you look at what Globe and Smart are doing in the Philippines with GCash and Padala, if you look at what MTN is doing in South Africa and indeed Vodafone with M-Pesa, that's where some of the leaders are. So it's not all in the developed economies. And the last point on this slide is very simple. We do have a genuine opportunity here for other regions around the world to skip an entire generation and to go straight to mobile broadband. And that's a pretty exciting prospect. In terms of technology trends, with the full 20 minutes that Nacho has given me, I've decided to pick one each on the network side and on the terminal side. Now, on the network access side, the biggest single topic that everybody's talking about is what comes next. I don't like using Gs because they don't mean a thing to me. 4G hasn't even been defined yet. It will be defined by the ITU this year, but it's pretty meaningless to customers anyway. So as far as I'm concerned, this is just the technology roadmap. But there is one. In fact, there are several. If we look at the main contenders, and apologies for the acronyms, for any of you that aren't familiar with them, there are basically technology roadmaps for each of the current cellular families. If you're in the CDMA camp, there's something currently deployed called EVDO, and there will be something called UMB. If you've deployed GSMA, wideband CDMA, HSPA is already being deployed, and we'll be going to LTE fairly soon. It's the worst name in history, by the way. It's called long-term evolution, but it's going to be here at the end of next year. We're not very good at marketing in mobile, you may have noticed. In terms of China, we have the TD-SCDMA system, which will be very important indeed. And of course, we have WiMAX. One point I did want to make is that our mobile operators actually aren't interested in technology wars. They don't like them because it just fragments the market and it prevents the kind of scale we were talking about. They're not religious, they're not idealistic or ideologistic. They deploy technology as they see fit, and they deploy different types of technologies. You may not know this, but we have China Unicom on our board, who until 2 days ago was one of the largest CDMA providers in the world, until the Chinese government decided to reshuffle all of the Chinese operators. We've had very public statements by people like Vodafone saying, we'll deploy WiMAX, we'll deploy LTE, we'll deploy whatever we see fit, quite frankly. These are business people, they're not religious zealots when it comes to technology. That being said, there have been some public announcements on what people are planning to deploy. I'm not going to read the list, you can see it in front of you. Suffice to say that LTE has very strong support, also from some of the CDMA camp, and of course there are very public statements around WiMAX, particularly in the United States with Sprint and Clearwire. Now, on the right-hand side here, you'll see a couple of forecasts. They're not particularly good forecasts, they're just average. There are tons of these forecasts. They differ maybe by 5–10% in different respects. The bottom line is they all have the same major trend, and that is by 2012, it will be 3G technologies that dominate, and they really will dominate if you look at the numbers. And of those 3G technologies, HSPA, the high-speed packet access system that's already deployed here in Spain, for example, will be something like 3 to 6 times larger than any rival. This is a race for scale, the same as 2G was. The race actually started more than a year ago, so we're already in it. Sadly, I don't have the time, but I would love to talk to you about fixed mobile convergence versus fixed mobile substitution. I'd love to talk to you about femtocells, and maybe I'll get a chance later. But Nacho will kill me if I spend too much time, so I'm going to skip very quickly onto the next slide. This is probably a topic that is going to occupy a lot of our time in the next 48 hours. On the platform side for devices, the single largest question is how can I reach even a fraction of those 50% of the world's population? Because the sad truth is, despite the fact that all of the attention is on high-end platforms, on smartphones, on things like Windows Mobile and Symbian, they're a niche market. Only 5 to 10% of phones actually have that kind of capability. Operators have to deploy services to their entire subscriber base. Application developers want to reach as many customers as possible. This is a very big challenge for our industry, and it's one that we actually haven't yet solved. So if that's the problem, what's the answer? There we go. Now, if I had the answer, I probably wouldn't be standing here, but let's look at some of the possible contenders. There's a lot of debate about operating systems, open operating systems. You hear an awful lot about Google Android, but I put the logos on the screen there of some of the other Linux-based systems that we have. We have OpenMoko, we have Limo, we have Lips, we have others, and they've been around for quite some time too, and they've got some traction as well. Now, I don't know which one of those is going to win or is going to gain the most traction, but the one question I would ask you is, even if they do, what percentage of the market will they have in the next 2 to 3 years? And the answer I will give you is not that much. So it's a great start, it's a good development, but it won't solve the problem on its own. In the past, we focused a lot on middleware layers, things like Java-based solutions, much broader access to terminals, much broader, but totally fragmented. If you talk to application developers, if you talk to operators, Java in principle should be the answer, but isn't because it's too fragmented. Ironically, one of the more successful approaches has been Qualcomm's Brew, but very proprietary, very closed. I know they've made new announcements, I think last week or this week. The Koreans, post their experience with Qualcomm, came up with their own. It was pretty much government mandated, WIPI, but that hasn't exported anywhere outside of Korea. So Java is full of potential, but has failed to actually deliver it. Now, if we look a little bit further ahead, if we look at browsers, widgets, gadgets, gears, the whole Web 2.0 space, the real question here is, can this be the viable platform on a mobile device? Can we have a browser-based application launcher? Can we see some of the technologies being used on the web on the device? And I think that's a very promising technology. There are questions about the APIs to the underlying operating system, to the metal. That's a challenge, but there's a lot of potential there. Another point here is that always on in a radio environment is a lie, actually. Most of you know that. You have drop calls, you have problems. So it's very challenging to provide that kind of true always-on experience in a radio environment. If you look at some of the new offline technologies, things like Google Gears, if you look at the developments in storage of mobile devices, then you can find out that some of these offline technologies can actually provide the appearance of always-on, even if you're only just mostly on. This is not my favorite topic, but I was asked to say something about regulatory trends. The most single obvious regulatory trend is that there's too much of it and it's increasing. That's obviously from the point of view of a trade association, I should add hastily. In 1990, there were only about 12 regulators worldwide. There are now 150. We have very established regulators. In the US, of course, we have the FCC. They've been very successful at exporting things like technology neutrality for licensing of spectrum, which has been adopted virtually everywhere in the world now. They've been having a lot of fun and games with net neutrality, which in my opinion is a proxy for an entirely different debate, which we'll probably come to later. And they're probably leading the world in terms of the digital TV dividend, in terms of the 700 megahertz auctions. Here in the European Union, the birthplace of GSM, I'm sad to say that the European Commission is increasingly interventionist. You're probably aware that we have had price regulation, not just at the wholesale level, but also at the retail level last year, and there's more to follow. If we look at other regions, the Arab region here is mentioned on the board, but there's also Latin America as well. They're taking the lead from the Europeans, and some of this same legislation is currently being reviewed. As far as I'm concerned, the one crumb of comfort is that, at least in some of the Asian markets, some of the Asian tiger economies, they have a slightly more cooperative approach, very proactive approach with industry, and I'd like to single out things like ubiquitous Japan, Korea, some of the Singaporean and Taiwanese initiatives as well. As far as we're concerned, there's a basic message here. If 50% of the world's population is using mobile, it's no longer a luxury. It makes a very large contribution to GDP. Even in the EU here, it's contributing about 1% per annum. If you want to get all that benefit, then you've got to see that mobile actually adds value. If you're trying to bridge gaps, which I'm going to come to in a moment, you need to recognize the value of mobile. Now, it's a cliche in the industry that spectrum is the oxygen of the industry, but it happens to be true. If you don't have the spectrum, you can't fill it. The digital dividend should blow a lot of oxygen back into the ecosystem, and that would be great. The World Radio Conference in 2007 was a fantastic start, a good compromise, but there's a lot of lobbying going on, particularly here in Europe, by the broadcasters, who have a very powerful lobby, to try and reverse some of those decisions. So just to focus on that one issue very briefly, the question is sometimes asked, do mobile operators really want this spectrum? Do they need it? 700 megahertz spectrum is perfect. It's great for coverage, it's great for in-building penetration, and there's lots of it. Do they want it? Well, in the US, they've just paid $18 billion for it. Draw your own conclusions. One thing I should say here is that I saw recently a video produced by the European Broadcaster Union that says that your 3G mobile phone will interfere with your digital TV set. This is at best misleading. It's at worst an outright lie. I was told to be provocative. I think I'm allowed to say that. So not only now do we have all the health scares saying that mobile will kill you, it'll also stop you watching your favorite football team at the same time. I'm going to turn now to a couple of mini case studies talking about bridging gaps. The first one is obvious. It's the access gap. If Maslow were to reinvent the pyramid of needs now, you'd probably put communication on there at the bottom, and you'd probably put internet access somewhere on there as well. It's very important. This is a recent study by the OECD in terms of broadband penetration. The most important statistic on here is the fact that there are only 235 million users in the OECD region, and there are probably only 350 million worldwide. And I say only because that's far too small. There is even a new divide, a new gap within that between those countries that are predominantly DSL and cable and those that are fiber. And there's a big financing gap in terms of making sure that that fiber is more prevalent. But far more important from the point of view of my particular talk here today is the fact that regions like Africa are being completely and utterly left behind. So the question is, can mobile do for data what it did for voice for regions like Africa? The first point I'd like to make here is that mobile broadband is already here. A lot of people don't realize that. If you've got technologies like EVDO for the CDMA camp, our own high-speed packet access for GSM, it's already available. It's live in 169 networks in 75 countries already. It's live here on all of the operators in Spain, for example, and there'll be 1.6 million people using it here in Spain by the end of the year. There are 500 different devices already available. 226 of them are handsets, not just USB dongles, which is quite an interesting statistic. There's even a camera, believe it or not, that's a HSPA camera. Subscribers look small compared to the billions we've just been talking about, but they're growing exponentially, as indeed is the data traffic. And we'll come back to that when we talk about flat rate pricing in a moment. But it's not a developed world phenomenon. The important point is wherever there are 3G licenses, you will see this technology deployed. On the board in front of you there, you can see some of the African nations that already have, and you can see indicative numbers in the take-up there already. So we're already starting. It may be small, but we're starting to bridge that gap. Some of our operators in Europe and elsewhere are going head-to-head with DSL. They're actually pitching mobile broadband at the same pricing levels as DSL and trying to take them on. Austria is a crazy market where it seems to be working. Cable growth is flat in Austria. Mobile broadband is really taking off. The best-selling device in Austria is a USB dongle. It outsells Nokia handsets. Apologies, Christopher. That's it's sad but true. It's also true in Sweden, by the way. USB dongles are outselling the best handsets. But I'd prefer to talk about this particular case study here in Indonesia because it's a good example. Here the product is being pitched as a fixed broadband replacement, and less than 12 months after deploying it, they've already overtaken fixed broadband. So there are more mobile users than there are fixed in less than 1 year. Now this is another gap, the financial services gap, and as Bank Inter is one of the sponsors of this particular foundation, I presume it's quite an interesting one for them as well. I think I'm right in saying that there are something like 1 billion people on the planet that have bank accounts, but there are 3.5 billion that have mobile phones. If you see the success of low denomination prepay and gifting of top-ups, you can see that there's a lot of potential for moving value around via mobile phones. The question is, can you do this person-to-person remittance in a very effective way? Is there a demand? Yes, there is. We've calculated there are more than 200 million migrant workers who regularly wire home money back to their home country in small denominations. The cost of doing that at the moment is very high indeed. So what we're trying to do here is to harness the power of mobile in order to make it easier, to make it ubiquitous in terms of reach, and to lower the cost. Now, we can't do that with mobile operators alone. We know that. So we've partnered with some of the financial institutions. We have working hub agreements with MasterCard and with Western Union, and we're currently in talks with other people as well. So this is the so-called GSMA Mobile Money Transfer Initiative. We've got 34 operators around the planet who are already engaged, 4 are live in pilots. Oops. I'm not having much joy with this clicker. This is a less than obvious gap, but it's a very important one, the energy gap. Why it makes commercial sense to be green, and it really does. In order to reach those 5.6 billion people I was talking about earlier, we have a small problem. 1.6 billion of them live in an area where there is no national grid. A further billion live in an area where the grid is unreliable, so they're either off-grid or the grid is off. All that mobile growth I was talking about, which we will deliver, is dependent on reaching people in these regions. If you have no electric grid at the moment, your only choice is to use diesel generators, which are a disaster for the environment. And I don't just mean because they run on biofuels. Operators are trialing the use of alternative energies, but it's very small scale. I was in Cairo a couple of weeks ago where they were demonstrating solar power, for example, but it's all marginal at the moment. So here's the opportunity. There will be in excess of 500,000 new base stations deployed in the coming years. If we get this right, not only will we reach more than 1 to 2 billion extra people, we could potentially save up to 75 million tons worth of carbon emissions. And more importantly, we could inject something like $30 billion into alternative energy supply. As you're probably aware, one of the biggest issues with alternative energy at the moment is it's unsustainable without subsidy. It's a chicken and egg situation. You need more investment in that in order to make it sustainable. With the sheer scale of mobile, if you put it together, this could be quite an enabler. This is our Green Power for Mobile initiative. It's only just started. I can't say very much more than that, but you can see the potential. But actually, if you're a mobile operator, it already makes sense. You already know that the price of oil has already been north of $130. Did you know that for some mobile operators, the cost of energy is 40 to 50% of their OPEX per year? We've had some figures from Barty here shown on the slide. They've calculated if you reduce the average power output of a BTS by about 200 watts, If you're a small operator, and I use the term lightly, with 10,000 base stations, you can save something like $4.3 million a year. If you're a larger operator, you can save $43 million a year. Now, they're having to deal not just with a lack of a grid, but power interruptions. And power interruptions are not just in the developing world, they're also starting to happen in the developed world as well. There's a lack of innovation. Everybody complains to me, they say, all the innovation is about radio, it's about bits per hertz. What about putting just a fraction of that R&D into power technology, into alternative power technologies? Imagine what we could achieve. Another interesting statistic is that our colleagues at Nokia, Ericsson, etc. have done wonders. Their latest base stations are fantastic, they're far greener, but that's their 3G variants. A lot of those 19 million people I were talking about are going to be supplied via 2G variants, and we do not see the same improvements in 2G that we did for 3G. That's a gap too. You can do a lot more here. You can reduce the overall power consumption on a site. You can use passive cooling. You can change the temperatures. You can do infrastructure sharing. There's an awful lot you can do. The good news is there's a financial incentive to do it, so this will happen. Again, it's a very big topic for our mobile operators at the moment. Finally, I was asked to give some thoughts on business models, and I've probably got about 2 minutes left to do that. So as you can imagine, this is not going to be a very exhaustive debate. So I'm just going to fire off a couple of provocative statements, because I was told to be provocative, and I like being provocative. Oops. If I can ever get the slide on the board. The first one is, I will put up there as a simple, basic axiom. Advertising cannot pay for everything. I'm sorry about that, because a lot of you will do very well out of advertising, and some of your business models are ad-funded. But it's simply true. Ignore the numbers. If you look at the size of those bars on the bar chart, there's more than $2 trillion currently in comms revenues for those telcos that you love so much. If you look at the amount of total advertising spend in the world, it's a fraction of that. If you look at the online and mobile portion of that, it's a fraction again. So this is simple economic fact. It doesn't matter that it's growing very fast, and it is. For the foreseeable future, advertising cannot take the place of all of those revenues. Having said that, advertising is a fantastic opportunity. At the GSMA, we're doing some work on advertising metrics so that you can actually measure the effectiveness of mobile advertising. We have a trial in the UK with all of the operators, and they're providing us with all of their WAP log data. So they know basically which website every single user has visited. That data is being collated, analyzed, and turned into metrics so that you can have a kind of a Nielsen rating. True census-level data for the power of your advertising. It's pretty exciting. A very big opportunity as far as I'm concerned, it's a personal opinion, is mobile search. I hate advertising because I find it very intrusive. I don't like banners, I don't like things I didn't ask for. If I'm looking for something on mobile search, I want it, and you're actually helping me to do what I want. Mobile search is non-intrusive, it should be immediate, and to be the most effective, it should be contextual, it should be location-based. Now, with apologies to Google here, I just couldn't help but do this one because it's been said to me many times. So I typed in coffee into a Google desktop search engine, and I got back Wikipedia, I got back the British Coffee Association, because they presumably figured out my IP address was in the UK. I tried it on mobile, google.com, I got pretty much the same thing. I got a coffee Wikipedia and the National Geographic. All I wanted was the location of the nearest Starbucks. And I'm hoping, by the way, that Christopher's going to help us with that a little bit later on. Again, apologies to Google. The simple point was there's a fantastic opportunity in mobile search. It's what people want. It gives extra value to advertisers in the local region. They will pay more. There's a higher pay per call and pay per transaction ratio. It's something like dollars instead of cents per pay per click. How flat is your flat rate? This is going to be popular as well, but actually all you can eat is a myth. That's a simple economic fact. Wherever there's actually an incremental cost, you cannot have all you can eat. The reality is just very large bundles. If you can give a bundled price that the average user doesn't go above, that has the appearance of being a flat rate. It's impossible to be truly flat. You don't have to take my word for it. There's a very amusing example on the screen in front of you. You may or may not be aware that the BBC launched a catch-up TV streaming service called the iPlayer in November. They had 1 million users within a very short space of time, and this, from one of the blogs, is what happened to their traffic. All the UK ISPs were up in arms. They went straight to the BBC and they said, you can't do this to us. According to Ofcom, it's going to cost us another £830 million. That's more than $1 billion to upgrade our networks to carry your traffic. And the BBC turned around and said, well, that's okay, because we're just helping you to provide a better service to your customers. Needless to say, the ISPs won't see 1 red cent in additional revenue. This is my answer to the net neutrality debate. On a slightly more serious note now, we hear a lot about winner takes all, about walled gardens, about all this sort of competition. The reality is there are a lot of opportunities for cooperating, co-opetition, some people call it, with neighboring industries. I've just picked the financial industry here because it's something that we're currently engaged in. Recent past is littered with examples of failed attempts by operators and banks to go head-to-head and to butt heads, JVs that have gone nowhere. We've learned our lessons. What we're trying to do now is to find out where there's alignment of interest, where banks and operators can work together to do something useful. This one's very simple. We call it pay by mobile. It's the equivalent of taking a contactless credit card. You may be familiar with them. MasterCard has their PayPass system. Visa has VisaWave. You can stick that on the UICC, what you would call the SIM card, and you can use your mobile phone to just touch and pay. This is already a fact in several countries around the globe. We've got 44 operators, I think, at the moment, increasing all the time, currently looking at this, and we've got trials planned in about 13 different countries. Countries like Japan and Korea are leading the way on that. In Europe, the French are doing a lot of things in this. They're using the same near-field communication technology, by the way, to do other things like transportation ticketing, loyalty schemes as well. It's a very exciting technology, and it's one in which the business models of banks, credit cards, and operators are aligned. Now, I do have a short promotional video here, but I think, Nacho, in the interest of time, I'll probably skip that. Now, I would have liked to have talked about all sorts of other things. We have initiatives on, for example, the mobile internet, on exposing third-party APIs to third-party developers. We have a mobile innovation program, and indeed Carlos, I think, was one of the judges at one of our recent events, but I'm afraid my time is probably up. And I hope that some of you might have some questions. So thank you very much. If there are any questions.
So we have a